The courtroom had never been this silent before. You could almost hear the weight of breath hanging in the air as a small figure made her way across the polished wooden floor. The click of her shoes was soft but sharp enough to echo. People leaned forward in their seats, whispering, holding their phones, their faces tight with disbelief. It was Emily Carter, 5 years old, messy brown hair falling into her face, wearing a faded dress that looked 2 sizes too big. She moved toward the judge's bench with a kind of determination no one expected from a child. Her father, James Carter, sat frozen at the defendant's table, his hands trembling. His chest tightened as his daughter's tiny body crossed the most sacred threshold in that room. Judge Margaret Hayes sat behind her elevated desk, the high back of her chair like a throne, but she herself confined to a wheelchair tucked beneath it. Her face, pale from years of pushing her body through pain, remained unreadable. She had been a judge for nearly 2 decades and thought she had seen everything. Violent outbursts, staged theatrics, even families begging for mercy. But never this, a child. Emily pressed her small palms against the heavy oak of the bench and looked up. Her green eyes caught the light streaming through the tall windows. With a clarity that startled even the court reporter in the back row, she spoke. "Judge Lady, if you let my daddy go free, I promise I'll make your legs work again." The words detonated in the room. Gasps, laughter, nervous coughs. One man muttered, "Is she serious?" while another shook his head. The prosecutor, Michael Tran, leapt to his feet, objecting before the sound had even faded. Yet all of that noise blurred for Margaret. Her gaze locked on the child's face, on those eyes that seemed impossibly ancient for someone so young. Something stirred inside her, a sensation she had buried since the car crash 3 years ago. The sensation of believing. And that's where this story begins. 3 weeks earlier, James Carter was waking up before dawn in their cramped apartment on the south side of town. The alarm clock glowed 5 buzzing until his rough hand silenced it. He sat up slowly, the springs of the old mattress groaning. On the nightstand lay a photograph of his late wife, Claire, smiling in the sunlight, holding baby Emily. James pressed his thumb against the glass before pulling himself out of bed. The apartment was modest, with peeling paint in the corners and a kitchen that smelled faintly of old coffee. Still, James tried to make it a home. He cracked eggs into a frying pan, the sizzle filling the room, and set out a bowl of cereal with milk for Emily. He always made sure she had something ready when she woke up. "Morning, Daddy," came a small, sleepy voice. Emily patted in, her stuffed rabbit dangling from one arm. Her cheeks were flushed from sleep, her hair tangled like a storm cloud. "Morning, Aunt, sweetheart," James said, trying to keep his tone light. He bent down and kissed the top of her head. "Got your favorite today, scrambled eggs with cheese." Emily smiled weakly but soon coughed, her thin chest heaving. James quickly reached for the inhaler on the counter. He shook it, pressed it gently into her tiny hand, and guided her to take a puff. She did, closing her eyes as the medicine helped open her lungs. This was their ritual. Asthma had been Emily's shadow since she was a baby. Winter made it worse, the cold air clawing at her lungs. James remembered nights sitting upright in bed with Emily cradled against his chest, rocking her while she gasped for air, whispering stories until she could breathe again. He had sold nearly everything of value, his wedding ring, his watch, even his old pickup truck, to keep her medicine stocked, but medicine cost more than construction work could cover. James worked long hours under the sun and rain, carrying steel beams, mixing concrete, sweating until his shirt clung like glue. His hands were cracked, his back ached, but his paychecks barely scraped by. His co-workers often talked about beers after work or new boots they had bought. James never joined in. He saved every cent for Emily. Then came the Tuesday that changed everything. Emily woke with fever, her forehead hot enough to make James recoil. Her breathing rasped in her chest, and her lips trembled with each shallow inhale. "Daddy," she whispered, voice dry, "I can't breathe very well." Panic surged through James's veins. He pressed a cool cloth to her head, whispered comfort, but knew the truth. She needed medicine immediately. He checked his wallet, empty but for a crumpled receipt and a family photo. He grabbed his phone and dialed his boss. "Mr. Peterson, please, I need an advance. My daughter's sick. Just $50. I'll pay it back next week." The voice on the other end was firm but apologetic. "James, I'm sorry. Policy's policy. No advances." The call ended. James sank to his knees beside Emily's bed. Her small hands twitched, her breath short and wheezing. Fear cut him deeper than any knife. He whispered, "Hold on, baby girl. Daddy's going to fix this." That night, after she drifted into fitful sleep, James put on his old jacket. He leaned over her, kissed her damp forehead, and whispered, "I'll be back soon." Then he stepped into the freezing night air, his heart pounding with dread. The pharmacy on Elm Street was lit bright against the dark sky. Inside, shelves gleamed with rows of boxes and bottles. Salvation sealed behind plastic. James stood outside, his fists clenching and unclenching. He had never stolen so much as a candy bar in his life, but desperation overrode morality. He entered, pulling his cap low. The pharmacist was busy with an elderly woman, and the cashier was counting her drawer. James's eyes darted to the children's medicine aisle. His hands shook as he picked up fever medicine and the inhalation treatment Emily needed. Together, they cost 2 days' wages he didn't have. He slipped them inside his jacket. Each step toward the door felt like dragging chains. He was almost free when a firm hand gripped his shoulder. "Sir," came a deep voice. James turned to see a security guard, tall, with kind but unyielding eyes. "Empty your pockets." James's world collapsed. He could run, but Emily's face flashed in his mind. Slowly, tears streaming, he pulled out the medicine. "Please," he whispered. "My little girl. She needs this. She might not make it through the night. I'll pay you back. I swear it." The guard hesitated, pity flickering across his face, but he shook his head. "I'm sorry, it's the law. I have to call the police." Within minutes, flashing lights painted the glass doors red and blue. James's wrists were bound in cold steel, and he was led outside as bystanders gawked. Shame burned his skin. Through it all, one thought repeated in his mind. Emily, at home. Their neighbor, Mrs. Parker, found Emily alone and crying. She rushed the child to the hospital, where doctors administered the very medicine James had tried to steal. Emily's breathing steadied, but social workers insisted she would be placed in foster care until her father's legal troubles were resolved. The case landed on Judge Margaret Hayes's desk. Margaret was known as fair but unbending. 3 years ago, a drunk driver had slammed into her car, crushing her spine and confining her to a wheelchair. Since then, she had buried herself in work, hiding grief and bitterness behind stern rulings. Compassion had little place in her courtroom. On the morning of James's trial, the courthouse overflowed. Some neighbors came to defend his character. Others shook their heads, insisting theft was theft. James sat at the defendant's table, wearing a borrowed suit too large for him. His face was drawn, his eyes red from nights without sleep. He had not seen Emily in 2 weeks, though Mrs. Parker told him the girl asked about him daily. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Hayes," the bailiff called. Everyone stood as Margaret rolled her wheelchair to the bench. She scanned the file, her expression unreadable. Desperate father, sick child, stolen medicine. She sighed inwardly. Sad, yes, but the law was clear. The prosecutor, Michael Tran, presented his case with polished words. "Your Honor, sympathy cannot excuse theft. Allowing this would set chaos loose. Mr. Carter threatened security and stole merchandise worth over $100. This is armed robbery by law. James's public defender, Laura King, did her best. She spoke of his clean record, his devotion to his daughter, the impossible choice between law and life. But Margaret had heard it all before. Rules were rules. Then the heavy wooden doors creaked open. Heads turned. Mrs. Parker entered, holding the small hand of a child with messy brown hair. Emily Carter. She looked around the cavernous courtroom with wide, searching eyes. When she saw James at the front, her face lit up like sunrise. "Daddy," she cried, breaking into a run. The bailiff stepped forward to block her, but Margaret raised a hand. "Let her go." Emily threw herself into James's arms. He hugged her tightly, tears blurring his vision. "I'm so sorry, baby girl. Daddy made a mistake." Emily pulled back, her small hands cupping his face. "It's okay, Daddy. I know you were just trying to help me." The room shifted. Hardened men blinked away tears. Women dabbed their eyes. Even Michael Tran faltered, his jaw tightening. Margaret cleared her throat. "Mr. Carter, the law's clear. You took what was not yours. There must be—" But she stopped as Emily turned, her gaze locking on the judge. The girl stepped forward, her tiny shoes echoing, until she reached the bench. She looked up, and with a voice steady beyond her years, she declared, "My daddy is a good man. He only took the medicine because I was very sick, and he loves me." Margaret's lips pressed together. "Sweetheart, I understand. But your father still broke the law?" Emily nodded solemnly. Then she reached out and touched Margaret's hand. "Judge lady, I can see your legs don't work. That makes you sad inside. My daddy says sometimes when people are hurt, they can't see the love around them. But I have a gift. If you let my daddy go free, I promise I'll make your legs work again." The courtroom exploded. Gasps, laughter, protests. "Ridiculous!" Michael Tran shouted. Margaret's heart, however, skipped. How could this child know the loneliness she buried deep? For 3 years she had resigned herself to paralysis, to a life half-lived. But in Emily's eyes burned something more powerful than reason. Faith. She banged her gavel. "Order!" Silence fell. Margaret studied Emily. "What you're saying is impossible. Doctors told me I'll never walk again." Emily smiled softly. "Sometimes doctors don't know everything. Sometimes miracles happen when people love each other enough." Margaret inhaled, her throat tight. Was she losing her mind? Or was this hope she felt? At last, she said, "Mr. Carter, under normal circumstances, I would sentence you to jail. But today, I will postpone sentencing for 30 days. If your daughter fulfills her promise, all charges will be dropped." Shock rippled through the courtroom. Michael objected furiously. Margaret silenced him. "In 30 days, we will see. Until then, Mr. Carter, you are free." James stared, unable to speak. Emily ran back to him, clutching his hand. "Don't worry, Daddy," she whispered. "Everything's going to be okay." As the gavel fell, dismissing court, Margaret Hayes sat frozen, her heart pounding. For the first time since the accident, she wasn't just a judge in a chair. She was a woman daring to wonder. What if? And so began 30 days that would test faith, love, and the very meaning of miracles. Outside the courthouse, the late autumn air bit with a sharp chill. James Carter held Emily's hand as they descended the wide stone steps. Around them, reporters pressed forward, microphones thrust in their faces, questions flying like arrows. "Mr. Carter, how do you feel about today's ruling? Do you really believe your daughter can heal a judge? Is this some kind of stunt?" James shielded Emily, his jaw tight. "No comment," he muttered, ushering her quickly past the flashing cameras. Emily, however, didn't seem fazed. She waved at one of the reporters and said in her sweet, clear voice, "Don't worry, you'll see soon." "Houghton." The reporters shouted louder, Their curiosity ignited. James hurried his daughter into the subway, his heart pounding. The ride home was silent except for the screech of rails. He stared at Emily, who swung her legs casually as if she hadn't just turned a courtroom upside down. At home, their apartment smelled faintly of Mrs. Parker's casserole. She had left it warming on the stove with a note. For you and Emily. Stay strong. James blinked hard, moved by the neighbor's kindness. Emily sat at the table, eating slowly, humming to herself. James couldn't hold back anymore. He leaned across, his voice breaking. Sweetheart, what you did today, it was so brave. But you understand what's at stake, right? If nothing happens, I'll go to prison for years. They'll take you away from me. Emily put down her fork and looked at him with those unshakable green eyes. Daddy, do you remember what Mommy always said? Miracles happen when love is stronger than fear. Sucking. James closed his eyes. Claire's voice echoed in his memory, warm and certain. He opened them again to find Emily smiling gently. I love you more than I'm scared of anything, she whispered. Tears welled in James's eyes. He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she squeaked. Across town, Judge Margaret Hayes sat alone in her study. The trial transcripts lay open on her desk, but her eyes weren't on the words. They were on her legs, motionless beneath the blanket across her lap. She could still feel the ghost of Emily's touch, the way the child had looked at her not with pity, but with certainty. It unnerved her more than any legal challenge she'd ever faced. Judges live by evidence, precedent, logic. But logic couldn't explain the warm tingle she swore she had felt when Emily pressed her hand against hers. Her phone buzzed. Dr. Alan Brooks. She hesitated, then answered. Margaret, his familiar voice came, professional yet concerned. I heard what happened in your courtroom today. The entire county is talking about it. Please don't let this fill you with false hope. Your injury is irreversible. I've told you that many times. Margaret's lips tightened. Alan, what if it's not only about the spine? What if it's about something deeper? Don't do this to yourself, he warned softly. I've seen too many patients chase false cures. It only makes the fall harder. She ended the call, her chest heavy. He was right. Yet she couldn't shake the memory of Emily's eyes that seemed to see beyond bone and nerve, right into her broken spirit. Meanwhile, James struggled to settle into a new rhythm with Emily at home. The first night back, she insisted on kneeling beside his bed and whispering, Good night, Daddy. Don't be scared. We're going to help the judge. James watched her small body curled up under thin blankets, her stuffed rabbit tucked beneath her chin. He whispered into the dark, God, if you're out there, please don't let her down. The days that followed stretched with a strange mixture of fear and wonder. Emily seemed to glow with confidence. She insisted they spend afternoons at the park, feeding ducks, drawing pictures, talking about happy things. One evening, James found her coloring furiously at the kitchen table. What are you making, sweetheart? Emily held up a picture. It showed a woman in a wheelchair surrounded by flowers and sunshine. It's Judge Margaret. I'm making her a new memory. James swallowed hard. And what will she do with it? She'll keep it in her heart until her legs remember how to walk. Emily answered simply, as if it were the most obvious truth in the world. James didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Across the city, Judge Margaret tried to resume her strict routines, morning case reviews, legal briefs, phone calls, yet her mind drifted to Emily. She replayed the child's words late at night, lying awake in her quiet house. Sometimes she would catch herself imagining what it would feel like to stand again, to dance the way she once had. Then she would scold herself for indulging in such foolishness. But even her body betrayed her. She found herself eating healthier, stretching her arms longer, breathing deeper, as though preparing for something she didn't dare name. On the fourth day, Margaret surprised herself. She picked up her phone, opened James Carter's file, and dialed his number. Hello? James's voice was wary, tired. This is Judge Hayes, she said formally. I'd like to speak with Emily. There was a pause and then a bright, cheerful voice. Hello, Judge Lady. Margaret felt her lips curve into an unpracticed smile. Hello, Emily. I wanted to ask, how do you plan to help me? Oh, I'm so glad you called, Emily said, excitement bubbling in her tone. But first, we need to be friends. You can't help someone unless you know them. Could you meet me at the duck pond tomorrow? Margaret blinked. The park on Maple Street? Yes, at 3 o'clock. And don't bring your judge face. Just bring you. Margaret laughed softly, the sound startling her. All right, Emily, I'll be there. Sahari. The next afternoon, Margaret wheeled herself nervously down the path to the pond. She wore a simple blue dress instead of her robes, her hair brushed with more care than usual. She hadn't dressed for anyone in years. Emily sat on the grass, tossing breadcrumbs to ducks, her yellow sundress bright against the green. James watched from a bench nearby, his expression protective but resigned. Judge Lady, Emily called, waving. Come sit with me. Margaret rolled closer, and Emily pressed breadcrumbs into her hand. They're hungry today. Don't be shy. For the next hour, Margaret fed ducks, listened to Emily's chatter, and even laughed when a bold duck clambered onto her wheelchair wheel. She hadn't laughed like that in years. Then Emily asked, What did you love doing before your accident? Margaret hesitated. I love dancing. Emily's eyes lit up. Me too. Do you miss it? Every day, Margaret whispered. Let's dance now, Emily said, springing up. Margaret shook her head. Emily, I can't. You don't need legs to dance, Emily replied. Your arms can dance. Your heart can dance. Watch. She moved gracefully, her small arms swaying, her head tilting in rhythm. She spun slowly, barefoot in the grass, sunlight catching in her hair. Margaret felt something stir, almost unconsciously. Her own arms lifted, her shoulders moving in time. For the first time in 3 years, she felt like she was dancing. You're dancing, Judge Lady, Emily cried, clapping. See? You remember. Tears slid down Margaret's cheeks. She whispered, I feel alive. Emily knelt, resting her tiny hands on Margaret's knees. Your legs are just sleeping, she said softly. When your heart wakes up all the way, they'll wake up too. Margaret couldn't feel the touch, but she felt the warmth. For the first time, she believed it might be true. That night, James tucked Emily into bed. Sweetheart, he asked gently, what if you're wrong? What if the judge doesn't get better? Emily snuggled deeper into her blanket. Then we'll still have given her hope, and hope is already a miracle. James kissed her forehead, overwhelmed by the wisdom in such a small package. But fate had its own test. The very next evening, Margaret visited the park again. She laughed as Emily showed her a drawing of the ducks. Then as she turned her chair toward the path, a stone caught the wheel. In an instant, the chair tipped. Margaret fell hard, her head striking the ground. People screamed. James ran forward, scooping Emily out of the way. Paramedics rushed in. Sirens wailed as they loaded Margaret into an ambulance. Hours later, the waiting room at County Hospital buzzed with fear. Neighbors, reporters, even courthouse staff had gathered. Dr. Alan Brooks emerged, his face grave. Judge Hayes has a severe concussion. She's unconscious. The next 24 hours are critical. James felt the world tilt. If she didn't recover, their fragile hope would shatter. Emily, however, stood calmly beside him. She squeezed his hand and said with quiet certainty, Daddy, this is the test. The judge's spirit is lost. I have to guide her back. Everyone turned to stare at the little girl. And with that, The real trial of faith was about to begin. The hospital waiting room smelled faintly of disinfectant and burnt coffee. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, turning every worried face pale. James Carter sat stiff in one of the hard plastic chairs, his arm wrapped protectively around Emily. His leg bounced restlessly, his boot tapping the linoleum floor in a nervous rhythm. Emily sat calmly, her stuffed rabbit perched in her lap. She stroked its ear absently, her gaze fixed on the double doors that led to the intensive care unit. She looked nothing like a child who had just witnessed a woman collapse and be rushed away in an ambulance. Around them, murmurs rippled, neighbors whispered, courthouse staff traded glances. Even a couple of reporters lingered with notebooks half hidden in their coats. Everyone wanted to know if Judge Margaret Hayes would live. Finally, the door swung open. Doctor, Alan Brooks stepped out, still in his scrubs. Fatigue etched into the lines around his eyes. The crowd surged forward. How is she, doctor? Someone asked. Will she be all right? Another demanded. Alan raised a hand, quieting them. Judge Hayes has a severe concussion. She's been unconscious for nearly 2 hours. The next 24 hours are critical. We don't yet know the full extent of the injury. Gasps, whispers. James felt his stomach twist, his chest tightening like a vice. If she didn't wake up, their fragile deal, their 30 days, everything would collapse. His fate, Emily's future, all of it. He looked down at his daughter, bracing himself for tears, but Emily's green eyes were steady. She took his hand in her small one and said quietly, Daddy, this is the test. Her spirit is lost. I have to guide it back. The room went silent around them. An elderly woman clutched her rosary. A young man shook his head in disbelief. Alan crouched in front of Emily, his voice gentle but firm. Sweetheart, Judge Hayes is very sick. She's not awake. She can't hear you. Yes, she can, Emily replied, her tone certain. Not with her ears, with her heart. Alan blinked. He'd spent decades trusting scans, charts, hard data. Yet this little girl looked at him as though she knew a truth medicine could never touch. James cleared his throat nervously. Doctor, please, could she just see the judge? Just for a few minutes? Alan hesitated. Hospital rules don't allow children in ICU. It's not safe. Then another voice cut in, unexpected, gravelly. What harm could it do? Everyone turned. It was Michael Tran, the prosecutor from the trial. He stood in the corner, his tie loosened, his face drawn. He looked different, less polished, more human. James's eyes narrowed. What are you doing here? Michael shifted awkwardly. I heard about the accident on the radio. I came because... He exhaled, glancing at Emily. Because I wanted to apologize. I didn't believe before. I thought this was all a stunt. But if Judge Hayes herself believed enough to risk her career, maybe I was wrong. The waiting room buzzed. The prosecutor, the man who had demanded James's punishment, was now defending Emily. Alan looked around at the hopeful faces. His training screamed no, but something in Emily's calm gaze held him. Finally, he sighed. 5 minutes, but I'll be in the room with her. If anything seems unsafe, it ends immediately. James's shoulders sagged with relief. Emily squeezed his hand and whispered, See? Even the doctor believes a little now. They followed Alan down a long white hallway. The beep of machines grew louder with each step. When they entered the ICU room, James felt his throat close. Margaret Hayes lay pale against the hospital sheets, wires and tubes surrounding her. Her once sharp features looked fragile, almost childlike. The monitors beeped steadily, measuring every fragile beat of her heart. Emily let go of her father's hand and climbed onto a chair beside the bed. She reached out and gently touched Margaret's arm. Hello, Judge Lady, she whispered. I know you can't hear me with your ears, but I know you can hear me with your heart. You're lost right now, but I can help you find the way back. James swallowed hard. his hands trembling. Alan stood at the foot of the bed, watching intently, skepticism and awe battling in his eyes. Emily closed her eyes. Do you remember the ducks at the pond? Do you remember how you laughed when one tried to climb on your chair? That was real joy. That joy is still inside you. Margaret's eyelids fluttered slightly. James's breath caught. Emily continued, her voice soft but insistent. Your spirit isn't broken, Judge Lady. It's just scared, like being lost in a forest at night. But there's a path back to the light. I can see it. It's made of all your happy memories. The first time you danced. The first day you became a judge. The time we danced together with our arms at the pond. The monitors showed Margaret's heart rate quickening, becoming steadier. Alan leaned forward, eyes wide. She's responding, he whispered. Emily opened her eyes, her small hand still resting on Margaret's arm. Come back, Judge Lady. Come back because the world needs you. Come back because you still have so much dancing to do. Come back because miracles are real. Suddenly, Margaret's fingers twitched. Her eyelids fluttered again, then opened. She blinked up at the bright hospital lights, disoriented. Judge Hayes, Alan said quickly, checking her pupils with a flashlight. Can you hear me? Do you know where you are? Margaret's gaze shifted until it landed on Emily's smiling face. Her lips trembled. Emily, I heard you. I was lost. In the dark. You showed me the way back. Emily giggled softly. Told you. You just needed to remember. James felt tears stream down his cheeks. Alan shook his head in disbelief. This defies everything I know. Then Margaret gasped. Her eyes widened. Doctor, I can feel my legs. The room froze. James's jaw dropped. Alan straightened sharply. That's impossible, he muttered. Your spinal cord injury. But Margaret lifted her head, eyes fixed on the blanket over her lower body. Concentrating, she willed her right foot forward. It moved, a tiny trembling motion, but undeniable. The monitors beeped wildly. Alan nearly dropped his pen. Dear God, Margaret began to cry. Emily, is this real? Emily clapped her hands joyfully. Your spirit woke up all the way. When it woke up, it told your legs it was safe to work again. That's all. Alan staggered back, running both hands through his hair. There's no medical explanation. None. James whispered hoarsely. Then maybe it isn't medicine. Maybe it's something bigger. For the next hour, Alan ran test after test. Margaret's leg movements grew stronger. She could flex her ankles, wiggle her toes. By the end, she even lifted her knees an inch off the bed. When Alan finally stepped back, his face was pale, stunned. I can't explain this, but I can't deny it. Judge Hayes, you are regaining function that should have been gone forever. Margaret looked at Emily with gratitude so deep it shook her. You did it, Emily shook her head. We did it together. James bent over, pressing a trembling kiss to his daughter's hair. For the first time in weeks, his chest felt light. Margaret took a shaky breath. Mr. Carter, all charges against you are dropped. More than that, I'll make sure you get work, proper work, with insurance. You and Emily deserve that. James choked back a sob. Judge Hayes, I don't know how to thank you. Margaret's gaze softened. Thank her. She's the one who reminded all of us what miracles really are. When in that sterile hospital room, under buzzing lights and blinking monitors, something impossible had happened. A child's faith had reached beyond law, beyond medicine, and awakened hope where it had long been dead. And the story was far from over, because miracles, once they begin, have a way of spreading. The morning sunlight streamed through the blinds of Margaret Hayes' bedroom, cutting across the pale walls in golden stripes. She lay still for a moment, eyes open, listening to the faint hum of the world outside, the distant rumble of cars, the bark of a neighbor's dog. For 3 years, and mornings had been mechanical. Her first action always to reach for the wheelchair by her bed. But today felt different. She shifted slightly, and her legs responded. Not perfectly, not easily, but with enough strength to press against the mattress. A rush of emotion surged up her throat. She sat up, tears already blurring her vision. She swung her feet gently over the side of the bed and placed them on the rug. For years, that simple act had been impossible. Now she sat there, trembling, her hands gripping the sheets, whispering, "Thank you, Emily." The doorbell rang. Margaret startled, wiping her tears quickly. When she wheeled herself to the living room, she still used the chair for safety. She found Dr. Alan Brooks standing there with a folder of test results. "Good morning, Judge Hayes," he greeted, though his tone carried both amazement and caution. "Alan," she said, smiling faintly, "you look like a man who hasn't slept." "I haven't," he admitted, handing her the folder. "I've run your scans 5 times. I brought in 2 colleagues for second opinions. Medically, what's happening shouldn't be happening. And yet," he trailed off, staring at her legs. Margaret shifted slightly in her chair, moved her toes deliberately. Alan's jaw tightened. "Every test says your spinal cord is irreparably damaged, but the evidence of my own eyes contradicts that. It's tearing apart everything I thought I knew." Margaret reached for his hand. "Maybe not everything. Maybe it's teaching us something new." Before Alan could answer, the phone rang. Margaret picked it up. On the other end was her court clerk. "Judge Hayes, I just wanted to confirm, are you really coming back today?" Margaret's heart thudded. She had been away from her courtroom for weeks, since the accident at the park. Word of her recovery had already leaked, spreading like wildfire through town. Some whispered it was a hoax, others called it a miracle. Reporters camped outside the courthouse, hungry for proof. "Yes," she said firmly. "Tell them I'll be there at 9 sharp." When she hung up, her hands trembled slightly. Alan frowned. "Margaret, are you sure you're ready? Walking in front of the entire county? The pressure—" She cut him off with a quiet smile. "Alan, for 3 years I dreamed of walking. I won't hide now." At 8:45, the courthouse steps swarmed with people. News vans lined the street, cameras aimed at the heavy wooden doors. Inside, when the courtroom buzzed, every seat filled. Lawyers whispered, clerks shuffled papers nervously. Townsfolk craned their necks. James Carter sat in the front row. His daughter Emily perched proudly beside him in her yellow dress. She swung her legs, humming softly, her stuffed rabbit in her lap. "Daddy," she whispered, tugging his sleeve. "She's going to shine today." James nodded, though his throat was tight. "I know, baby girl. I know." The bailiff's voice boomed. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Hayes." Everyone stood. The double doors opened, and there she was. Margaret Hayes walked slowly but steadily down the aisle, supported by a cane. The room gasped as one. Reporters' cameras clicked like machine guns. Neighbors wiped their eyes. Some crossed themselves. Margaret's steps were careful, but every movement was defiant. She reached the bench, turned, and looked out at the crowd. For the first time in years, she didn't feel small. She felt alive. "Please be seated," she said, her voice ringing with quiet power. The room sat, but the murmurs continued. Before beginning the docket, Margaret lifted her hand. "Before we proceed with today's cases, I have something to say." The murmurs died instantly. 3 weeks ago, I believed my life was over. My accident had taken more than my ability to walk. It had stolen my hope. Then a child reminded me that miracles happen when love is stronger than fear. She reminded me that healing isn't only about the body, it's about the spirit. She looked directly at Emily, who beamed. "This court exists to uphold the law," Margaret continued, her voice firm. But justice is not only about punishment, it is also about mercy, about recognizing the humanity in those who stand before us. From this day forward, I vow to carry both law and compassion equally in my heart. The courtroom erupted into applause. Even Michael Tran, the prosecutor, clapped slowly, his eyes shining. That night, news broadcasts across the state replayed the footage. Judge Hayes walking into her courtroom, declaring miracles real. Some anchors called it the story of the year. Others raised skeptical eyebrows, calling it a stage spectacle. In living rooms, diners, in church halls, people argued, was it divine intervention, a medical anomaly, or simply a trick of timing and perception? But in the Carter apartment, none of that mattered. James cooked spaghetti in their small kitchen while Emily sat at the table drawing. She held up her picture, Margaret standing tall beside ducks at the pond. "See, Daddy?" She remembered. James ruffled her hair. "She did. And so did I." Emily tilted her head. "Remembered what?" "That sometimes," James said softly, "the world gives us more than rules. It gives us second chances." Meanwhile, Margaret sat in her study, Kane leaning against the desk. She stared at a box she hadn't touched in years, her old ballet shoes. With trembling fingers, she lifted them out. The satin was frayed, the ribbons yellowed, but when she held them to her chest, she felt her heart beat stronger. She whispered into the quiet room, "Tomorrow, I'll dance again." But not everyone celebrated. In a dim bar across town, a man leaned toward another. "You see the news? That judge walking again?" He scoffed. "Miracles are more like manipulation. You know what this means? Every case she touches now will be suspect. Defense attorneys will call her biased, unstable." The second man nodded grimly. "The state'll have to investigate. Judges don't make rulings based on fairy tales." Whispers of inquiry began. Anonymous complaints filed. Margaret's newfound joy would soon be tested by the very system she had dedicated her life to. One evening, she received a letter on official stationery. "The Judicial Ethics Committee requests your presence for review regarding recent courtroom conduct." Her hands trembled as she held the letter. She had risked everything by believing in Emily. Now her career might hang in the balance. That same night, James tucked Emily into bed. She sensed his worry immediately. "Daddy, what's wrong?" He sighed, brushing her hair back. "They might take the judge's job away. Some people don't believe what happened. They think it makes her unfit." Emily hugged her stuffed rabbit tighter. "That's silly. She's better now because she remembered how to hope. Why can't they see that?" James kissed her forehead. "Because the world is afraid of what it can't explain." Emily's green eyes shone in the dim light. "Then we'll just have to remind them too." And so, as Margaret prepared to face the stern questions of her peers, and James braced for the storm of public opinion, Emily, 5 years old, small but fierce, began planning her next step. Because miracles, once born, need defending. The letter from the Judicial Ethics Committee sat heavy on Margaret Hayes's desk. The bold black ink seemed to pulse, reminding her of the choice she had made, to give a desperate father freedom, based on the promise of a child. In the eyes of the law, it was irregular, maybe reckless. In the eyes of her heart, it was the first truly human decision she had made in years. She sat alone in her study that night, Kane resting against her chair. The old ballet shoes lay on the desk beside the letter, a strange juxtaposition of her past joy and her present burden. She whispered into the stillness, "Was I wrong?" Her phone buzzed. A message from James Carter. "Emily wanted me to tell you not to be scared. She says your spirit is still awake." Margaret chuckled softly, tears springing to her eyes. "That child," she murmured. "She carries the wisdom of the world in her pocket." The next morning, Margaret wheeled herself, not because she needed to, but because the cane was still new and she didn't want to stumble, into the committee hearing. A long mahogany table stretched across the room. 5 stern-faced members sat waiting, files open before them. Reporters hovered outside, pressing cameras to the glass. "Judge Hayes," the chairwoman began, "we are here to determine whether your actions compromise the integrity of the court. You released a defendant based on the alleged supernatural claims of his daughter. Do you admit this?" Margaret sat straighter. "I admit I released Mr. Carter because I chose compassion alongside the law. His crime was driven by desperation, not malice. As for his daughter," she hesitated, then looked each committee member in the eye. "I will not apologize for believing in hope." The members exchanged glances. One man scoffed, "Hope? This is a court of law, not a church." Margaret's voice grew stronger. "The law exists to protect people, but people are more than rules and statutes. They are hearts, spirits, families. Without compassion, law becomes a hammer, striking without mercy. That is not justice." Silence fell. For a moment, the only sound was the scratch of a pen. Then the chairwoman said, "We will deliberate. You will hear our decision within the week." Margaret left the chamber, her chest heavy. Outside, cameras flashed. "Judge Hayes, do you believe in miracles?" one reporter shouted. "Were you manipulated by a child?" demanded another. Margaret raised her chin. "I was not manipulated. I was reminded. Sometimes it takes a child to remind us that justice is more than punishment." Across town, James and Emily watched the news from their tiny apartment. James's hands clenched into fists. "They're trying to tear her down." Emily, perched cross-legged on the couch, hugged her rabbit. "Daddy, don't worry. People will see. When the truth shines, it shines too bright to hide." 3 days later, that truth began to spread. Mrs. Parker, the neighbor who had taken Emily to the hospital, gave an interview. She described how Emily had comforted her when her back was in pain, how the child's kindness had lifted her spirits. Soon others came forward. The boy whose broken arm healed faster than expected. The elderly woman who swore Emily's hugs took away her chronic pain. Local papers ran headlines. "The little girl who brings healing." Church groups called her a blessing. Skeptics barked louder, demanding evidence, dismissing it as coincidence. But the tide was turning. Meanwhile, Margaret's progress stunned doctors. She moved from cane to cautious steps without support. Physical therapists marveled as she regained balance, coordination, and strength. Alan Brooks, her doctor, stopped trying to explain it. Instead, he found himself smiling whenever Margaret entered the room. One evening, after a particularly long session, Alan helped her back to her chair. Their hands brushed. For the first time, Margaret felt something she thought she had lost with her accident, the stir of affection. Alan cleared his throat awkwardly. "Margaret, if you'd ever like to get dinner somewhere without medical charts between us?" Her laugh rang out, light and surprised. "Doctor, are you asking me on a date?" Alan blushed, but nodded. She whispered, almost to herself, "Miracles everywhere." The Judicial Ethics Committee delivered their verdict a week later. Margaret entered the chamber with her cane, Emily and James waiting nervously outside. The chairwoman read aloud, "This committee finds no misconduct. While unconventional, Judge Hayes acted within her discretion. Furthermore, in light of her recovery and the overwhelming support from the community, we commend her courage." Relief flooded Margaret's body. She stepped outside, reporters shouting. James embraced her, tears in his eyes. Emily clapped her hands and said, "See? They remembered too." Months passed. Life shifted gently, like a river changing course. James began his new job as maintenance supervisor at the hospital, finally earning enough to provide for Emily's medicine without fear. Margaret continued therapy, her steps steadier each week. One spring afternoon, the courthouse was decorated with flowers, not for a trial, for a wedding. Margaret Hayes, radiant in a simple ivory gown, stood hand in hand with Dr. Alan Brooks. Music filled the hall, soft and joyful. Guests smiled, whispered, wiped their eyes. Emily, wearing a crown of daisies, scattered petals down the aisle, her giggles echoing. James watched from the front row, pride swelling in his chest. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to exhale. During the reception, Margaret and Alan took to the dance floor. She moved slowly, carefully, but with grace. Each step was a victory, each turn a celebration. The crowd erupted in applause as she leaned into Alan's arms. Emily tugged on James's sleeve, whispering, "Daddy, do you know the best part of miracles?" James knelt beside her. "What's that, sweetheart?" "They don't stop. Once people believe, more miracles come. And when people believe together, wonderful things happen all the time." James hugged her tightly, his throat thick with emotion. He thought of Claire, his late wife, of her favorite saying, "Miracles happen when love is stronger than fear." He looked at Margaret dancing, at Alan smiling, at Emily glowing like sunlight. In that moment, he knew Claire had been right all along. 6 months later, Margaret opened court with a smile instead of a scowl. James flourished in his new job. Neighbors trusted him again, and Emily became a symbol of hope far beyond their town. And somewhere, in homes where people had stopped believing, in hearts that had been heavy too long, a spark was reignited, a spark planted by the words of a child who believed that impossible things could happen. Because miracles aren't just rare events, sometimes they are simply love choosing to stand taller than fear. And if this story touched your heart, if you believe love can still spark miracles, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that remind us of the extraordinary power hidden in everyday lives.